Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the sands of time, where tonight we shall drift along the eternal Nile into the heart of ancient Egypt. Settle yourself comfortably, perhaps with a warm cup of tea or a glass of water nearby, and allow your modern worries to dissolve like sugar in the morning light. Tonight, we explore a world where beer was not merely a beverage, but the very foundation of civilization itself, flowing through Egyptian society like the life-giving waters of their great river. You are safe here in your comfortable present, with your knowledge of brewing science and alcohol content clearly labeled on bottles, as we venture into a time when a single mug of beer could render a grown person unconscious, and when the art of brewing was considered sacred magic. The ancient Egyptians would have marveled at our understanding of fermentation, just as we marvel at their ingenious methods that created liquid sustenance strong enough to sustain pharaohs and powerful enough to commune with gods. If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below, and I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen.
Imagine yourself awakening before the first light touches the eastern horizon, in a modest mud brick house along the fertile banks of the Nile, some 3,000 years before your time. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of river water and the lingering smoke from yesterday's cooking fires. You are not alone in this pre-dawn stirring, for throughout the village, families are beginning the most important ritual of their day, one that will be repeated at noon and again at sunset. This is not the preparation of bread, though that too holds sacred significance, but rather the careful tending of the thick, bubbling brew that sits in large clay jars in the coolest corner of every home. The Egyptian word for beer was zythum, though the common people simply called it henket, and it flowed through their lives like the Nile itself flows through their land, essential and eternal. Unlike the clear golden beverages we might imagine, this ancient beer was thick as porridge, often consumed through reed straws to filter out the chunks of grain and herbs that gave it both substance and strength. The alcohol content could reach 15 to 20%, making it nearly as potent as modern wine. Yet it was consumed by everyone, from nursing mothers to young children, diluted appropriately for age and constitution. Watch as the woman of the house approaches the brewing vessels with reverence, for she understands that within these earthenware containers, the gods themselves are at work.
Khnum, the ram-headed deity who shapes humans on his potter's wheel, is also the patron of brewers, and his divine breath transforms simple barley and emmer wheat into liquid sustenance. She peers into the bubbling mixture, noting the thick foam that indicates healthy fermentation, and whispers a quiet prayer of gratitude. The surface moves with tiny bubbles, each one a sign that the mysterious transformation continues, that the grain is dying and being reborn as something far more powerful. The brewing process begins days earlier, with barley and emmer wheat being soaked until they sprout, then dried and ground into coarse meal. This malted grain is mixed with water from the sacred Nile, water that carries the blessing of Hapi, the god of the annual flood. Date syrup or honey might be added for sweetness, along with herbs like coriander, juniper, or the bitter compounds from various plants that we can no longer identify. The mixture ferments naturally in the warm Egyptian air, wild yeasts working their ancient magic to transform sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. What makes this beer so dramatically potent compared to our modern brews is not merely the higher alcohol content, though that plays its part. The ancient Egyptians did not understand the science of fermentation in our modern sense, but they had perfected an art that created beverages of startling complexity and strength. The thick consistency meant that each mouthful contained concentrated nutrients and alcohol, while the addition of various herbs and fruits could create psychoactive effects that went far beyond simple intoxication. As the sun climbs higher, painting the mud brick walls with warm golden light, you witness the first consumption of the day. The father of the household, a farmer whose hands are already stained with earth from checking his irrigation channels, approaches the beer jar with a long reed straw. He inserts it carefully through the foam and takes a measured draw. His face remains impassive, but you notice the slight relaxation in his shoulders, the way his breathing deepens slightly. This is not recreation but necessity, for the beer provides calories, B vitamins, and minerals that his grain-heavy diet might otherwise lack. The children gather for their portions, smaller cups filled with beer that has been diluted with Nile water and sweetened with date syrup. Even at this reduced strength, the alcohol content would be sufficient to kill harmful bacteria that might lurk in their water supply, making beer paradoxically safer than water itself. They drink solemnly, understanding, even at their young age, that this daily ritual connects them to their ancestors and to the gods who make their survival possible. By mid-morning, as the sun climbs toward its merciless noon position, the effects of the morning beer become apparent throughout the village.
Voices carry a slightly different timbre. Work songs flow more freely from the fields, and the harsh edges of poverty and labor seem temporarily softened. This is not drunkenness in our modern understanding, but rather a gentle cushioning against the relentless demands of survival in the ancient world. The alcohol provides not just physical sustenance, but psychological relief from lives that are precarious and often brief. In the workshops where craftsmen labor over pottery, jewelry, and textiles, beer breaks punctuate the day with ritualistic precision. The master craftsman, whose skills have been passed down through generations, maintains a steady rhythm of work and refreshment that keeps his hands steady and his mind focused. Too little beer, and the monotonous work becomes unbearable. Too much, and the delicate precision required for fine work becomes impossible. Finding this balance is itself a skill, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, a knowledge as vital as any technical expertise. The potency of ancient Egyptian beer becomes most apparent during religious festivals, when special brews are prepared with additional herbs and higher alcohol content. During these celebrations, entire communities might consume quantities that would render modern drinkers unconscious within hours. Ancient texts describe festival-goers falling into deep trances, experiencing visions and communing directly with the gods through the sacred intoxication that only the most powerful brews could provide. As afternoon shadows begin to lengthen and the punishing heat of midday starts to relent, the second major beer consumption of the day begins.
This time, the entire extended family gathers, including grandparents whose knowledge of brewing stretches back decades, and visiting relatives who bring news from distant villages. The beer jar for this meal is different, having fermented longer and containing additional ingredients that make it more potent than the morning brew. The grandfather, respected for his years and wisdom, drinks first, his weathered hands steady despite his age. The beer's strength shows in the slight glassy quality that comes to his eyes, in the way his voice takes on the rhythmic cadence that signals the beginning of story time. As the alcohol works its ancient magic, the barriers between past and present seem to dissolve, and the old man becomes a conduit for the voices of ancestors long dead, their wisdom flowing through him like the beer flows through his veins. The women of the household take their portions with quiet dignity, understanding that the beer not only nourishes their bodies, but connects them to the goddess Hathor, who is depicted in temple carvings, both nursing infants and presiding over brewing vats. The association is not accidental, for in Egyptian cosmology, the creation of beer mirrors the act of giving life itself, the transformation of simple ingredients into something capable of sustaining and altering consciousness. As twilight approaches, and the scorching desert wind begins to settle into evening's gentle breath, you find yourself drawn deeper into the mysteries that unfold within the humble brewing corners of Egyptian homes.
The setting sun paints the Nile's waters copper and gold, and in this magical hour between day and night, The true art of brewing reveals itself in ways that would astonish our modern understanding of fermentation science. In the corner of the family courtyard, behind a reed screen that provides both privacy and protection from dust, stands an array of vessels that represents the accumulated wisdom of centuries. These are not merely containers, but carefully crafted instruments of transformation, each shaped by master potters who understand that the clay itself must breathe, must allow the mysterious forces within the fermenting grain to work their ancient alchemy. The largest jar, broad-bellied and narrow-necked, holds the primary fermentation, its surface alive with a foam that moves like a living thing in the gentle evening breeze. Watch closely as the woman of the house, whose name is lost to time but whose expertise echoes through generations, approaches her brewing vessels with the same reverence a priest might show before entering a temple's inner sanctum. Her movements are deliberate, practiced, each gesture refined through decades of daily repetition. She carries a reed torch that flickers in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows that make her work seem even more mystical, more connected to forces beyond the merely physical world. The first jar she examines has been fermenting for 3 days, and already the transformation is remarkable.
What began as a thick porridge of ground barley, emmer wheat, and Nile water has become something entirely different, something that bubbles and hisses with its own internal life. She inserts a clean wooden stick and stirs gently, releasing an aroma that is simultaneously sweet and sharp, earthy and ethereal. The scent carries hints of the date syrup that sweetens the mixture, the coriander seeds that add complexity, and something else, something indefinable that speaks to the wild yeasts working their magic in the warm Egyptian air. But this brewing process involves secrets that go far beyond the simple ingredients visible to casual observation. Hidden within the thick mixture are additives that would surprise modern brewers, substances that transform this beverage from simple alcohol into something approaching a pharmaceutical preparation. Mandrake root, known to induce vivid dreams and deep sleep, might be added in carefully measured quantities during certain phases of the moon. Blue lotus petals, sacred to the goddess Isis, contribute not only their delicate flavor, but their mild psychoactive properties, creating beer that can transport the drinker into altered states of consciousness. The woman reaches for a small clay vessel, sealed with beeswax and marked with hieroglyphic symbols that few outside her family can read. Within this precious container lies her most closely guarded secret, a starter culture passed down through her maternal line for generations uncounted.
This thick yeasty paste contains strains of wild yeast that have been carefully maintained and fed, creating a brewing culture unique to her household. When she adds a small portion to each new batch, she is not merely inoculating her beer with microorganisms, but connecting her family's daily sustenance to the accumulated wisdom of her ancestors. The alcohol content that results from this ancient process often exceeds what modern beer drinkers would consider possible or safe. While contemporary beers typically range from 3 to 12% alcohol by volume, these Egyptian brews regularly reached 15 to 20%, with special ceremonial batches climbing even higher. The thick consistency meant that each mouthful delivered a concentrated dose of both nutrients and intoxicants, while the addition of psychoactive plants created effects that went far beyond simple inebriation. As the evening deepens and the first stars appear in the darkening sky, neighboring families begin to gather in the courtyard, drawn by the completion of a particularly potent batch that has been fermenting for an entire week. This is not merely a social gathering, but a community ritual that reinforces the bonds between households and ensures that brewing knowledge continues to flow from generation to generation. The eldest women examine the finished product with critical eyes, tasting small samples and nodding their approval or suggesting adjustments for future batches. The testing process reveals just how powerful this ancient beer truly is.
A visiting merchant from upstream, accustomed to the lighter brews of his own region, accepts a full cup without understanding its potency. Within minutes, his speech becomes slurred, his movements uncoordinated. The village women exchange knowing glances but show no alarm, for this is not unusual. They have seen strong men rendered unconscious by a single large serving of their most potent brews, have watched experienced drinkers stumble and fall after consuming what appeared to be modest quantities. The children observe these proceedings with solemn attention, for they are witnessing their future inheritance, learning through observation the subtle arts that will one day sustain their own families. They note which herbs are added at which stages of fermentation, how the stirring motion affects the final product, why certain clay vessels produce better results than others. This knowledge cannot be written down, for most of these people cannot read or write, but must be absorbed through patient observation and careful practice. One of the most remarkable aspects of this ancient brewing tradition is its integration with the rhythm of agricultural life along the Nile. The brewing schedule follows the annual flood cycle, with different types of beer produced at different seasons depending on the availability of various grains and the temperature of the fermenting environment.
During the inundation season, when fields lie underwater and agricultural work is minimal, families focus on producing their strongest brews, taking advantage of the leisure time to create the complex, long-fermented beverages that will sustain them through the challenging months ahead. The brewing vessels themselves tell stories of remarkable sophistication in ceramic technology. The clay used in their construction comes from specific deposits along the Nile, clay that has been mixed with organic materials like chopped straw and animal dung to create a porous yet durable material that breathes with the fermenting beer. The shape of each vessel has been refined over generations to optimize fermentation conditions, with narrow necks that reduce contamination while allowing gases to escape, and broad bases that provide maximum surface area for the complex biochemical processes that transform grain into intoxicant. As midnight approaches and the merchant who sampled the potent brew now lies unconscious beneath a woven mat, snoring peacefully under the star-filled desert sky, the brewing woman begins preparation for tomorrow's batch. She measures grain by handfuls, her fingers automatically gauging the correct proportions developed through decades of practice. Each ingredient is added with deliberate intention, from the barley that provides the fermentable sugars to the mysterious herbs that will transform simple alcohol into something approaching a sacred potion. The process requires constant attention and adjustment, for the wild yeasts that drive fermentation are temperamental partners in this ancient dance of transformation.
Too much heat, and the fermentation proceeds too rapidly, creating harsh flavors and excessive alcohol. Too little warmth, and the process stalls, leaving the brewer with a flat, unsatisfying product that lacks both potency and character. The skilled brewer learns to read the subtle signs, the way the foam forms and dissipates, the sounds of active fermentation, the changing aromas that indicate whether the batch is progressing properly. In the darkness before dawn, as the unconscious merchant continues his beer-induced slumber, and the village settles into the quiet hours before morning labor begins, you witness something that captures the essence of ancient Egyptian brewing culture. The brewing woman performs a final ritual, pouring a small libation of her finished beer onto the ground as an offering to the gods who make fermentation possible. The liquid disappears quickly into the thirsty earth, but its purpose extends far beyond mere ceremony. This offering represents the Egyptians' understanding that brewing is not merely a technological process, but a partnership with divine forces that remain mysterious even to our modern scientific understanding. They knew, through centuries of observation and refinement, how to create beverages of remarkable potency and complexity. But they also understood that success required more than technical skill. It required a proper relationship with the invisible forces that transform death into life, grain into spirit, simple ingredients into substances capable of altering human consciousness and connecting mortals with the realm of the gods.
As the first hint of dawn begins to pale the eastern horizon, painting the mud brick walls of the village with soft rose and amber hues, you witness the profound ways in which this potent ancient brew shapes not merely individual lives, but the very fabric of Egyptian society itself. The unconscious merchant still sleeps deeply beneath his woven covering, his peaceful breathing a testament to the overwhelming power of the village's strongest beer, while around him the community begins to stir with the practiced rhythms of people who have learned to function with remarkable competence despite daily consumption of beverages that would incapacitate modern drinkers.
In the house across the narrow dirt lane, an elderly widow named Nebet begins her morning ritual with movements that speak of decades of careful practice. Her husband died during the last inundation, swept away by the angry floods when he tried to save a neighbor's grain store, and now she maintains her brewing operation alone. But she is far from isolated, for the sharing of beer creates bonds between households that transcend mere neighborly courtesy, weaving a social safety net that ensures no family faces disaster alone. Watch as she approaches the door of the house where the merchant lies sleeping, carrying a small clay cup filled with a mild morning brew, diluted with honey and water from the sacred Nile. The morning beer ritual serves multiple functions that reveal the sophisticated understanding these ancient people possessed regarding both nutrition and social cohesion.
As families emerge from their dwellings, each carrying their own brewing vessels and sharing cups, the narrow lanes between houses become arteries of communication and mutual support. Children run between households, carrying messages and small portions of beer that serve as offerings, payments, and gifts simultaneously. The alcohol content, while lower in these morning portions, still provides enough psychoactive effect to smooth the rough edges of poverty, labor, and interpersonal conflict. In the workshop district, where craftsmen begin their daily labors as the sun climbs toward its punishing noon position, the relationship between beer consumption and skilled work reveals itself with startling clarity. The master jeweler, whose delicate hands must set precious stones in gold settings no thicker than papyrus, maintains a precise schedule of beer consumption throughout his working day. Too little alcohol, and his hands shake with the nervous tension of handling valuable materials. Too much, and his fine motor control disappears entirely. The balance he maintains would seem impossible to modern workers, yet it represents knowledge refined over generations of craftsmen who understood that their survival depended on finding the perfect equilibrium between sobriety and intoxication. The beer's extraordinary potency becomes most evident during the weekly market day, when farmers, craftsmen, and merchants from distant settlements converge in the village's central plaza. The sun beats down mercilessly on the assembled crowd, but the constant circulation of beer cups creates an atmosphere of relaxed conviviality that facilitates trade and negotiation. Deals that might require hours of tense bargaining in our modern world are concluded with remarkable speed, as the alcohol dissolves barriers of suspicion and regional rivalry that might otherwise impede commerce. Watch as a grain merchant from the northern delta encounters a pottery seller from the southern reaches near the First Cataract. Their dialects differ, their customs vary, their natural inclination might be mutual distrust, but the shared consumption of the local beer creates instant common ground. The grain merchant, accustomed to lighter brews from his marshy homeland, quickly discovers that southern beer carries a punch that threatens to overwhelm his business judgment. Yet rather than creating chaos, this inequality of tolerance becomes a tool of negotiation, with experienced local traders knowing exactly how much of their potent brew to offer visiting merchants to create optimal conditions for favorable deals. The brewing knowledge itself represents a form of currency and power that flows primarily through female lineages, creating networks of influence that operate parallel to the formal hierarchies dominated by men. The woman whose beer consistently achieves the perfect balance of strength and flavor finds her social status elevated far beyond what her family's material wealth might otherwise dictate. Marriage negotiations take into account not just dowries of gold and livestock, but the brewing expertise that a potential wife brings to the union. A woman whose family line possesses particularly effective fermentation cultures or knowledge of rare ingredients might marry far above her apparent social station. These brewing cultures, passed down through maternal lines like precious heirlooms, represent biotechnology of remarkable sophistication. Each family's unique strain of wild yeast produces beverages with distinctive characteristics, not merely of flavor, but of psychoactive effect. Some produce beer that induces profound relaxation and deep sleep, perfect for easing the aches of manual labor. Others create beverages that enhance alertness and creative thinking, prized by scribes and artists. Still others yield beer with mild euphoric properties, sought after for religious ceremonies and festival celebrations. The seasonal cycle of brewing reveals how deeply integrated these practices are with the natural rhythms of life along the Nile. During the months of inundation, when fields lie underwater and agricultural work is impossible, families focus their energy on producing their most ambitious brews. These are the batches that ferment for weeks or even months, developing alcohol contents that approach those of modern spirits, while maintaining the thick, nutritious consistency that makes them food as much as drink. The long fermentation process allows complex flavors to develop, but also provides time for potentially dangerous bacteria to be overwhelmed by alcohol and beneficial microorganisms. In the heat of summer, when temperatures soar and preservation becomes critical, brewers produce lighter, more acidic beers that resist spoilage in the brutal climate. These summer brews often incorporate additional herbs with antimicrobial properties, creating beverages that are simultaneously refreshing and protective against the diseases that flourish in hot weather.
The alcohol content, while lower than winter brews, is still sufficient to purify questionable water and provide essential calories during periods when fresh food becomes scarce. The winter brewing season brings the production of ceremonial beers that push the boundaries of both alcohol content and psychoactive enhancement. These special brews incorporate ingredients that must be gathered during specific phases of the moon, herbs that grow only in remote desert locations, and fermentation techniques that have been refined over generations. The resulting beverages are so potent that they are consumed only during religious festivals and major life transitions, when the goal is not merely sustenance or mild intoxication, but actual communion with divine forces. As afternoon shadows begin to lengthen and the market day reaches its drowsy peak, you observe a phenomenon that illustrates the remarkable tolerance these ancient people had developed for alcohol consumption. A young scribe, perhaps 20 years old, methodically works his way through a complex business transaction involving the purchase of papyrus, ink, and writing implements. His handwriting remains steady, his calculations accurate, his bargaining sharp. Yet you can see the telltale signs that he has been consuming beer steadily since dawn. His eyes hold the slight glassy quality of intoxication. His movements carry the careful deliberation of someone managing impaired motor control, yet his professional competence remains essentially unaffected. This functional alcoholism represents not addiction in our modern sense, but rather adaptation to environmental conditions that make constant mild intoxication preferable to complete sobriety. The water supply, despite coming from the sacred Nile, carries parasites and diseases that alcohol helps neutralize. The brutal heat and harsh living conditions are made more bearable by the cushioning effect of constant mild inebriation. Most importantly, the calories and nutrients provided by thick, beer-based diet help prevent malnutrition in a society where food security is always precarious. The communal aspects of beer consumption reveal themselves most clearly during the evening meal, when extended families and neighbors gather in courtyards that have been swept clean and sprinkled with water to settle the dust. The beer vessels that circulate are not individual portions, but shared containers, with each person drinking through their own reed straw, but from common vessels that symbolically unite the entire gathering. The alcohol facilitates conversation and storytelling, dissolving the hierarchical barriers that might otherwise prevent free exchange of ideas between different generations and social classes. During these evening gatherings, the truly potent brews make their appearance, carried in special vessels that are handled with ceremonial reverence. These are the batches that have been fermenting for weeks or months, developing alcohol contents that rival modern spirits while maintaining the complex nutritional profile that makes them viable meal replacements. The person honored with the first taste understands that they are about to experience something that could dramatically alter their consciousness, yet this is not regarded as recreational indulgence, but as participation in ancient traditions that connect the living community with their ancestors and their gods.
The merchant who fell unconscious the previous evening finally begins to stir as the sun approaches the western horizon. His slow awakening observed with gentle amusement by villagers who remember their own first encounters with truly potent Egyptian beer. His experience represents not failure or excess, but rather initiation into understanding just how different these ancient beverages are from anything our modern world produces. As he slowly sits up
accepting a cup of diluted beer mixed with honey to ease his transition back to consciousness. He joins the ranks of those who have discovered that ancient Egyptian brewing represented not primitive technology, but sophisticated biotechnology that created beverages of remarkable complexity and power. As evening settles over the village and the brewing woman prepares her vessels for another night of fermentation, the cycle continues unbroken, each day's production adding to the accumulated wisdom of generations. The bubbling vats contain more than fermenting grain and wild yeast. They hold the essence of a civilization that understood fermentation as a sacred art, alcohol as medicine and sacrament, and beer as the liquid foundation upon which their entire society was built. In the gathering darkness, illuminated by flickering oil lamps and the gentle glow of cooking fires, you witness a way of life in which intoxication and sobriety, work and rest, individual need and community obligation are woven together in patterns of remarkable sophistication and enduring wisdom.
Let us drift now from the humble village brewing vessels to the grand corridors of power, where beer played roles that would astonish modern minds with their complexity and profound significance. Our journey carries us along the Nile's eternal flow to Memphis, the gleaming capital of the New Kingdom during the reign of Ramesses II, when Egypt's power stretched from Nubia in the south to the Levant in the north. Here, in the shadow of the Great Pyramids and within the sprawling complex of the Pharaoh's palace, we encounter a figure whose life illuminates the sacred dimensions of brewing that transcended mere sustenance or pleasure. Waset, fourth son of the great Ramesses II, possessed titles that reveal the elevated status of brewing in Egyptian royal culture. He was not merely a prince, but the chief royal brewer, the master of sacred fermentation, and the keeper of divine intoxicants, positions that placed him among the highest religious and administrative officials in the kingdom. Unlike his warrior brothers who earned fame on distant battlefields, Waset's domain was the mysterious realm where grain became spirit, where human craft merged with divine intervention to create beverages capable of facilitating communication between mortals and gods. The responsibilities that fell upon Waset's shoulders would seem impossible to modern administrative minds. He oversaw not merely the production of beverages for the royal household, but the creation of sacred brews used in temple ceremonies throughout the kingdom.
Every major religious festival, every coronation, every funeral of significance required specific types of beer, brewed according to formulas that had been refined over millennia. The brewing complexes under his supervision employed hundreds of specialists, from grain selectors who could identify the perfect barley by touch and smell, to fermentation masters whose knowledge of wild yeast cultures represented state secrets as closely guarded as military strategies. Imagine yourself walking beside Prince Waset as he conducts his morning inspection of the royal brewing facilities, a complex of buildings that rivals the temples in both size and sacred importance. The air is thick with the rich aromas of fermentation, dozens of different brews in various stages of completion, filling massive clay vessels that stand as tall as a person and require several strong men to move when filled. Each vessel bears hieroglyphic inscriptions that identify not only its contents, but the specific divine purpose for which the beer is intended. For, in Egyptian cosmology, different gods required different types of sacred intoxication to manifest their presence among mortals. The brewing process that unfolds under Waset's supervision operates on a scale and with a complexity that dwarfs the village operations we witnessed earlier. Entire rooms are devoted to the cultivation and maintenance of dozens of different yeast strains, each carefully preserved and fed according to rituals that blend practical knowledge with religious ceremony.
The prince understands that these microscopic organisms are not merely biological agents, but actual manifestations of divine creative force. And their proper care requires not just technical skill, but spiritual purity and constant devotion. In one dimly lit chamber, illuminated by oil lamps that burn continuously to maintain precise temperature conditions, master brewers tend to the most sacred of all fermentation vessels,
These contain the ingredients for the beer that will be consumed by the pharaoh himself during the most important religious ceremonies. Brews so potent and sacred that their mere preparation requires purification rituals lasting for days. The alcohol content of these royal brews often exceeds 25%, approaching the strength of modern spirits, while additional ingredients create psychoactive effects that can induce profound altered states of consciousness. Chaim Wasset moves through these sacred brewing chambers with the measured pace of a high priest, for indeed his role combines religious and administrative functions in ways that modern governmental structures could never accommodate. He tastes samples from different vessels, his trained palate capable of detecting subtle variations in fermentation progress, alcohol content, and the complex interplay of herbs and additives that give each brew its distinctive character. His approval or rejection of a particular batch can determine whether a religious ceremony proceeds as planned, or must be postponed until suitable replacement beverages can be prepared. The ingredients available to royal brewers reveal the vast extent of Egyptian trade networks and the enormous resources devoted to brewing excellence.
Barley and emmer wheat form the foundation, but these are supplemented with exotic additions that arrive by caravan from distant lands. Frankincense from the land of Punt adds both flavor and sacred significance. Cinnamon from far eastern kingdoms provides warmth and complexity. Lotus petals from specially cultivated temple pools contribute their mild psychoactive properties, while date syrup from the finest oasis palms provides sweetness that ferments into additional alcohol. The most closely guarded secrets of royal brewing involve ingredients that remain mysterious even to modern scholars. Ancient texts refer to the tears of Isis, a substance that could intensify the consciousness-altering effects of beer to profound levels. Some scholars believe this refers to extracts from psychoactive mushrooms. Others suggest it might be concentrated alkaloids from various desert plants. But the exact nature of these additives died with the master brewers who understood their preparation and use. What we know for certain is that royal ceremonial beers could produce effects that went far beyond simple intoxication, creating states of consciousness that priests and pharaohs interpreted as direct communication with the gods. The training required to become a master royal brewer began in early childhood and continued for decades. Young apprentices, often drawn from families that had served the brewing operations for generations, started by learning to identify different types of grain by touch, smell, and even taste.
They memorized the seasonal cycles that determined optimal brewing conditions, the phases of the moon that influenced fermentation, and the complex prayers and purification rituals that accompanied each stage of the brewing process. Only after years of observation and practice were they allowed to handle the precious yeast cultures, and master brewers might spend entire lifetimes without being entrusted with the most sacred formulas. Chaim Wasset's personal chambers within the palace complex reveal the elevated status that brewing expertise commanded in Egyptian society. His walls are decorated with scenes depicting the brewing process as a divine act of creation, with gods and goddesses presiding over fermentation vessels, while hieroglyphic texts preserve brewing formulas in the same script used for the most sacred religious instructions. His personal library contains papyrus scrolls that detail not only practical brewing techniques, but the theological significance of fermentation. Documents that treat the transformation of grain into alcohol as a fundamental mystery of existence comparable to the daily resurrection of the sun god Ra. The social and political dimensions of Chaim Wasset's position become apparent during state banquets and diplomatic receptions, where the quality and potency of the beer served communicates messages as complex as any formal diplomatic protocol. Foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries are offered specific types of beer that reflect both their status and Egypt's relationship with their nations.
A minor tributary ruler might receive excellent but relatively mild beer, while the representative of a major allied power would be honored with access to the most potent and sacred brews normally reserved for religious ceremonies. The effects of these diplomatic beers often determined the success or failure of important negotiations.
The overwhelming potency of royal Egyptian beer could render foreign dignitaries unconscious within hours, creating situations that skilled Egyptian diplomats could exploit to secure favorable agreements. Alternatively, the consciousness-altering effects of certain sacred brews could induce spiritual experiences that visiting rulers interpreted as divine approval for proposed alliances or treaties. The line between hospitality and psychological manipulation remained deliberately blurred, with brewing expertise serving as a tool of statecraft as sophisticated as any military strategy. During religious festivals, Khayyam Waset's responsibilities reached their peak complexity and sacred significance. The Opet festival, celebrating the annual renewal of Pharaoh's divine power, required the production of thousands of gallons of specially prepared beer, each batch calibrated for specific ceremonial uses. The beer consumed by priests during the festival's most sacred moments possessed alcohol content and psychoactive properties that enabled them to channel the voices of gods, providing oracular pronouncements that guided state policy for the coming year. The precise formulation of these ceremonial brews represented knowledge so sacred that it was transmitted only through direct oral instruction from master to carefully selected apprentice.
The brewing complex also served as a center of scientific observation and experimentation that would not be out of place in a modern research facility. Master brewers under Khayyam Waset's supervision maintained detailed records of fermentation conditions, ingredient variations, and resulting alcohol content, creating a body of empirical knowledge about brewing that represented some of humanity's earliest systematic scientific investigation. They understood the relationship between temperature and fermentation speed, the effects of different water sources on final product quality, and the complex interactions between various herbs and psychoactive additives, knowledge that enabled them to create beverages of remarkable consistency and potency. The death of master brewers created succession crises that could affect the stability of the kingdom itself, for their specialized knowledge was often too complex and sacred to be fully transmitted even to their most trusted apprentices. When the elderly master of sacred fermentation who had served Khayyam Waset's father died suddenly without completing the training of his designated successor, the prince was forced to undertake a desperate mission to the ancient brewing centers of Upper Egypt, seeking alternative sources of the specialized knowledge needed to maintain the royal brewing operations. The journey, which lasted several months and required the prince to undergo purification rituals at multiple temple sites, illustrates just how critical brewing expertise was considered to the proper functioning of Egyptian civilization.
As our exploration of Khayyam Waset's world draws to its first close, we see him in the pre-dawn darkness of his private brewing chamber, tending to a fermentation that has been in progress for 6 weeks. This is not ordinary beer, but a brew intended for his own father's upcoming Sed festival, the ceremony that will renew Ramesses II's divine authority for another cycle of rule. The alcohol content of this sacred beverage will exceed 30%, while the carefully selected psychoactive additives will create a consciousness-altering experience so profound that the pharaoh will temporarily transcend human limitations and commune directly with the gods who legitimize his earthly power. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by the gentle sounds of fermentation, Prince Khayyam Waset embodies the profound truth that in ancient Egypt, brewing was not merely craft or commerce, but the sacred art of facilitating divine presence in human affairs. The crisis that would define Prince Khayyam Waset's career and reveal the true power of ancient Egyptian brewing began on an unremarkable morning during the 3rd month of the inundation season, when the Nile's annual flood had transformed the valley into a vast inland sea. The prince was conducting his routine inspection of the sacred fermentation chambers when a messenger arrived bearing news that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom's religious and political stability.
The high priest of Amun at Thebes, second only to the pharaoh in spiritual authority, lay dying, and the traditional funeral beer required for his proper passage to the afterlife had been contaminated by forces that the temple brewers could neither understand nor remedy.
The implications of this disaster extended far beyond mere ceremonial inconvenience. In Egyptian cosmology, the proper preparation and consumption of funeral beer was essential for the deceased's successful navigation of the dangerous journey through the underworld, and the high priest's spiritual power was so great that his death rituals would affect the cosmic balance that maintained Egypt's prosperity and security. Without the correct sacred beer, prepared according to formulas that had been refined over thousands of years, the high priest's ka might become lost in the realm of the dead, potentially unleashing supernatural chaos that could manifest as famine, plague, or military defeat. Khaimwaset's response to this crisis reveals the extraordinary sophistication of royal brewing operations and the prince's own mastery of fermentation arts that bordered on the miraculous. Within hours of receiving the messenger's urgent summons, he had mobilized a brewing expedition that resembled a military campaign in its scale and complexity. Dozens of master brewers, hundreds of specialized workers, and entire cartloads of rare ingredients began the journey up the Nile toward Thebes, racing against time to create a replacement batch of funeral beer before the high priest's death made proper burial impossible.
The brewing process required for this emergency production pushed the boundaries of what even master Egyptian brewers considered possible. The traditional funeral beer for a high priest required ingredients that normally took months to properly prepare, including barley that had been buried in temple courtyards for specific periods, water that had been blessed at multiple sacred sites along the Nile, and fermentation cultures that had been maintained in unbroken succession since the time of the pyramid builders. Most challenging of all, the brewing process itself required 49 days of carefully controlled fermentation, while the dying priest was not expected to survive more than 2 weeks. The solution that Khaimwaset devised drew upon brewing knowledge so advanced and sacred that it had been used only a handful of times in Egyptian history, during crises that threatened the survival of the kingdom itself. This technique, known in the most secret temple texts as the divine acceleration, involved the use of specially prepared fermentation accelerants that could compress the normal brewing timeline into a fraction of its usual duration, while actually enhancing rather than diminishing the final product's potency and sacred effectiveness. The accelerants themselves represented biotechnology of remarkable sophistication, combining concentrated cultures of the most active yeast strains with extracts from psychoactive plants that had been processed according to alchemical procedures that remain mysterious even to modern science.
The preparation of these substances required not only technical expertise, but spiritual purification so intense that the brewers involved had to undergo ritual death and rebirth ceremonies, symbolically dying to their ordinary human consciousness in order to channel the divine knowledge necessary for success. As Prince Khaimwaset and his brewing expedition established their operations in a specially consecrated area near the Theban temples, the normally invisible world of Egyptian fermentation science became visible in ways that would astonish modern observers. The brewing vessels used for this emergency production were not ordinary clay containers, but specially blessed ceremonial equipment that had been stored in temple treasuries for generations, waiting for exactly such a crisis. These sacred fermentation chambers were made from clay that had been mixed with ground bones of sacred animals, gold dust, and powdered precious stones, creating ceramic vessels that were believed to possess inherent magical properties that enhanced fermentation. The brewing process began with rituals that lasted 3 days and nights, during which Prince Khaimwaset and his master brewers underwent purification ceremonies that were normally reserved for the pharaoh's own coronation preparations. They fasted completely, consuming only small amounts of sacred water from the Nile's source, while temple priests burned incense containing psychoactive substances that induced altered states of consciousness believed necessary for successful communication with the divine forces that governed fermentation. The selection and preparation of ingredients for this sacred brew revealed the vast network of knowledge and resources that supported royal Egyptian brewing operations. Barley and emmer wheat were chosen not merely for their quality, but for their spiritual pedigree, with each grain coming from fields that had been blessed by specific deities and harvested according to astronomical calculations that aligned the brewing process with cosmic forces. The water used came from a sacred well within the temple complex, water that was believed to flow directly from the primordial ocean of chaos from which all life emerged. The most extraordinary aspect of this emergency brewing operation was the use of fermentation techniques that seemed to anticipate modern understanding of biochemistry by thousands of years. The master brewers, under Kayamwaset's supervision, controlled fermentation temperature with precision that rivaled modern temperature-controlled brewing systems, using a combination of underground chambers, carefully positioned ventilation systems, and even ice imported from the distant mountains to maintain optimal conditions. They monitored fermentation progress using methods that combined empirical observation with what can only be described as intuitive understanding of microbial processes. The addition of psychoactive and consciousness-altering substances to this sacred brew followed procedures that had been refined over millennia of careful experimentation. Blue lotus petals were added at precisely timed intervals during fermentation, their psychoactive compounds integrating with the alcohol to create effects that went far beyond simple intoxication. Extracts from the mysterious tears of Isis were measured with accuracy that suggests sophisticated understanding of dosage and concentration, while various herbs and minerals contributed both flavor and spiritual potency to the final product.
As the accelerated brewing process unfolded over 10 intense days, the effects of the divine fermentation became apparent not only in the rapidly developing beer, but in the consciousness and behavior of everyone involved in its creation. The master brewers, sustained only by small amounts of diluted ceremonial beer and constant exposure to the psychoactive vapors rising from the fermentation vessels, began to exhibit signs of profound altered consciousness that they interpreted as direct communication with brewing deities. Their movements became ritualistic, their speech took on the rhythmic patterns of sacred chants, and their technical decisions seemed to flow from sources of knowledge that transcended normal human learning. Prince Kayamwaset himself underwent a transformation during this critical brewing operation that those who witnessed it described in terms that suggest profound mystical experience. As the leader of the brewing team, he was required to taste samples from the developing beer multiple times each day, consuming amounts of the potent, psychoactive brew that would have rendered ordinary people unconscious for days. Yet rather than becoming incapacitated, the prince seemed to achieve a state of consciousness that allowed him to perceive the fermentation process with supernatural clarity, making adjustments and refinements that struck observers as divinely inspired. The final product of this emergency brewing operation exceeded even the most optimistic expectations of the temple priests and royal officials who had commissioned it.
The funeral beer that emerged from Prince Kayamwaset's accelerated fermentation process possessed an alcohol content that approached 40%, making it stronger than most modern spirits, while the complex array of psychoactive additives created effects that were described in contemporary accounts as capable of temporarily separating the soul from the body, allowing the deceased high priest to experience his own funeral and consciously direct his passage into the afterlife. The funeral ceremony itself provided dramatic proof of the extraordinary potency of this sacred brew. The ritual participants, including the pharaoh's own representatives and the highest-ranking priests from temples throughout Egypt, consumed the funeral beer as part of the ceremonial communion with the deceased. Within minutes, many experienced profound altered states of consciousness that contemporary accounts describe in terms that suggest genuine mystical experiences.
Some participants reported direct communication with the departed high priest, receiving final instructions and blessings that were interpreted as confirmation of successful passage into the realm of the dead. The success of this brewing crisis established Prince Waset's reputation as perhaps the greatest master of fermentation arts in Egyptian history, but it also revealed the enormous risks involved in creating beverages of such overwhelming potency. Several participants in the funeral ceremony remained unconscious for days after the ritual, their minds apparently unable to fully return from the altered states induced by the sacred beer.
One elderly priest was found dead 3 days after the ceremony, with no apparent cause of death other than what witnesses described as his soul's apparent reluctance to return to ordinary consciousness after experiencing the divine realms opened by the funeral beer. The political consequences of this brewing triumph extended throughout the kingdom and beyond its borders. Foreign dignitaries who witnessed the funeral ceremony returned to their homelands with stories of Egyptian beer so potent that it could facilitate actual communication with the dead, enhancing Egypt's reputation for possessing supernatural powers that no neighboring civilization could match. The brewing techniques developed during this crisis were incorporated into the regular operations of royal breweries throughout Egypt, raising the standard of sacred beer production to levels that required even more intensive training and spiritual preparation for master brewers. The personal cost to Prince Waset of achieving this brewing miracle became apparent in the months following the funeral ceremony. The intensive exposure to extremely potent psychoactive substances during the emergency brewing operation had permanent effects on his consciousness and perception that were both beneficial and challenging. He developed an almost supernatural ability to perceive the subtle processes of fermentation, able to diagnose problems in brewing batches by scent alone, and to predict the final alcohol content of developing beer with uncanny accuracy. However, this enhanced brewing sensitivity came with psychological consequences that made ordinary life increasingly difficult for the prince.
The consciousness-altering effects of constant exposure to sacred brewing vapors and regular consumption of test samples from the most potent ceremonial beers created a persistent state of mild altered consciousness that, while enhancing his brewing expertise, made him appear increasingly otherworldly to courtiers and family members. His speech began to incorporate the rhythmic patterns of brewing chants. His movements took on the deliberate pace of ceremonial ritual, and his interests gradually narrowed to focus almost exclusively on the sacred arts of fermentation. The transformation of Prince Waset from royal administrator to something approaching a brewing mystic illustrates the profound psychological and spiritual effects that regular exposure to ancient Egyptian beer could produce. Unlike modern alcoholism, which typically involves progressive deterioration of function and health, the prince's condition represented what contemporary observers interpreted as a form of divine possession, a state in which his human consciousness had been partially replaced by direct connection to the brewing deities who governed fermentation. His expertise reached levels that seemed supernatural to those who witnessed it, yet this enhancement came at the cost of his ability to function normally in the political and social spheres that had previously defined his life. As we observe Prince Waset in the aftermath of his greatest brewing triumph, tending to his fermentation vessels in chambers that have become as sacred as any temple sanctuary, we see the ultimate expression of ancient Egyptian brewing culture's power to transform human consciousness.
In the flickering light of oil lamps that burn continuously to maintain optimal fermentation temperatures, surrounded by the gentle sounds of bubbling beer that has become the soundtrack of his existence, the prince embodies both the extraordinary potential and the profound risks inherent in a civilization that understood fermentation not merely as a means of creating intoxicating beverages, but as a gateway to direct communion with divine forces that govern the fundamental processes of life, death, and transformation. The final chapter of Prince Waset's extraordinary life began during the 15th year of his tenure as chief royal brewer, when the aging prince embarked upon the most ambitious and dangerous brewing project in recorded Egyptian history. The occasion was the approaching death of his father, Ramesses II, whose reign of 66 years represented one of the longest and most prosperous periods in Egyptian civilization. The funeral beer required for such a pharaoh's passage into the afterlife demanded not merely exceptional potency and sacred preparation, but the creation of a beverage that could sustain the royal ka through what Egyptian theology described as the most perilous and complex journey any soul could undertake. The brewing formula that Khaimouset developed for this ultimate challenge drew upon every secret technique, every sacred ingredient, and every mystical procedure that had been accumulated over millennia of Egyptian fermentation arts.
This was to be no ordinary funeral beer, but what the most ancient texts referred to as the eternal brew. A beverage so potent and spiritually charged that consuming it was said to temporarily grant the drinker the consciousness of the gods themselves, allowing mortal minds to perceive the hidden mechanisms that governed life, death, and rebirth throughout the cosmos. The ingredients assembled for this final brewing project revealed the full extent of Egypt's wealth and international connections, as well as the profound respect accorded to brewing expertise within the civilization's power structure. Barley came not from ordinary fields, but from sacred plots that had been blessed by every major temple in Egypt and tended by priests whose families had maintained these special crops for generations. The water was drawn from 7 different sources along the Nile, each representing one of the sacred aspects of the river god Hapi, and blessed according to rituals that required the participation of the pharaoh himself. The psychoactive components of this eternal brew pushed far beyond anything that had been attempted in previous royal brewing projects. Blue lotus petals were harvested only during the darkest nights of the new moon, when their psychoactive properties were believed to reach their peak potency. The mysterious tears of Isis were prepared in quantities that represented the entire kingdom's accumulated supply, a substance so rare and sacred that its use for this single brewing project effectively depleted Egypt's reserves for a generation.
Additional ingredients included frankincense resin that had been aged in temple vaults for over a century, cinnamon from the most distant trading routes, and honey from bees that fed exclusively on sacred lotus blossoms. The fermentation process itself required the construction of an entirely new brewing facility, built according to architectural principles that treated the building not merely as a workplace, but as a temple dedicated to the divine forces that govern transformation and transcendence. The primary fermentation chamber was designed as a replica of the pharaoh's burial chamber in his tomb, creating a symbolic connection between the brewing process and the royal passage into the afterlife. The walls were decorated with hieroglyphic texts that preserved the most secret fermentation formulas, inscriptions so sacred that viewing them without proper purification was considered a crime punishable by death. The actual brewing began with ceremonies that lasted for an entire month, during which Prince Khaimouset and his team of master brewers underwent purification rituals of unprecedented intensity. They consumed only sacred water and small amounts of ceremonial beer, while subjecting themselves to psychological and spiritual preparations that were normally reserved for the pharaoh's own journey into the afterlife. The prince himself spent 7 days and nights in complete isolation, consuming carefully measured amounts of psychoactive substances that induced visions interpreted as direct communication with brewing deities who provided guidance for the challenging work ahead.
The fermentation process that followed challenged every assumption about the limits of ancient brewing technology and the capabilities of wild yeast cultures in creating high-alcohol beverages. Using techniques that remain mysterious to modern brewing science, Khaimouset and his team achieved alcohol concentrations that exceeded 50%, creating a beverage that was essentially a spirit while maintaining the thick, nutritious consistency that characterized traditional Egyptian beer. The fermentation took place in vessels that had been carved from single blocks of granite and lined with gold, materials chosen not for their practical brewing properties, but for their ability to channel and focus the spiritual energies that were believed to be as important as biological processes in creating the eternal brew.
The psychological effects of working on this ultimate brewing project began to manifest among the brewing team within days of beginning the fermentation process. The constant exposure to vapors rising from the fermenting eternal brew, combined with the intensive spiritual preparation and regular consumption of test samples, created states of consciousness that contemporary observers described in terms that suggest profound mystical experiences. Master brewers reported direct communication with deceased brewing masters from previous generations, receiving technical guidance and spiritual instruction that enabled them to refine their techniques beyond what normal human knowledge could achieve. Prince Haim Wasset himself underwent a transformation during the creation of the eternal brew that was so dramatic that those who witnessed it struggled to describe it in ordinary language. The regular consumption of samples from the developing beverage, necessary to monitor its progress and make adjustments to the fermentation process, exposed him to psychoactive substances of unprecedented concentration and complexity. Rather than becoming incapacitated, as would happen to any normal person exposed to such potent intoxicants, the prince seemed to achieve a state of consciousness that transcended ordinary human limitations while maintaining his technical expertise and spiritual focus. Contemporary accounts describe Prince Haim Wasset during this period as having developed capabilities that seemed supernatural to those around him. He could perceive the progress of fermentation processes in dozens of different vessels simultaneously, making minute adjustments to temperature, humidity, and ingredient ratios based on sensory perceptions that extended far beyond normal human capabilities. His speech began to incorporate languages and dialects that no one recognized, yet somehow conveyed technical information about brewing processes with perfect clarity. Most remarkably, he seemed to require very little sleep, spending most of each 24-hour period in the brewing chambers, sustained apparently by the continuous consumption of small amounts of the developing eternal brew. The completion of the eternal brew coincided almost exactly with the death of Ramesses II, as if the brewing process itself had been synchronized with the cosmic forces that govern royal transitions. The final product was a beverage unlike anything that had ever been created in human history, possessing an alcohol content that rivaled modern grain alcohol, while incorporating psychoactive substances that could induce consciousness alterations of unprecedented intensity and duration. The color was deep amber with hints of gold that seemed to move and shift in lamplight, while the aroma combined the rich sweetness of fermented grain with complex herbal notes that suggested mysteries beyond ordinary understanding. The funeral ceremony of Ramesses II provided the ultimate test of the eternal brew's extraordinary properties. As the most powerful individuals in Egyptian society, including members of the royal family, high priests from every major temple, and representatives from foreign kingdoms, participated in the ritual consumption that would facilitate the pharaoh's passage into the afterlife. The effects of the eternal brew on these participants were so profound that they became the subject of legends that persisted for centuries afterward. Stories of temporary transcendence of human consciousness that allowed mortals to witness the hidden mechanisms of death and rebirth. Prince Haim Wasset himself, as the creator of the eternal brew, was required to consume a full ceremonial cup as part of his role in facilitating his father's funeral rites. The effects of this consumption on someone who had already been profoundly altered by months of exposure to the brewing process created a transformation that witnesses described in terms that suggest he achieved something approaching divine consciousness. For 3 days following the funeral ceremony, the prince remained in a state that observers interpreted as direct communication with his deceased father, receiving final instructions about the continuation of royal brewing traditions and the preservation of fermentation secrets for future generations.
The aftermath of creating and consuming the eternal brew marked the beginning of Prince Haim Wasset's gradual withdrawal from ordinary human affairs and his progressive transformation into something that his contemporaries could only describe as a living embodiment of brewing wisdom. His consciousness seemed to have been permanently altered by exposure to psychoactive substances of such extraordinary potency that he could no longer function effectively in normal social and political situations. Yet rather than representing decline or impairment, this transformation was interpreted by those around him as a form of divine ascension, a successful transcendence of human limitations that allowed him to commune directly with the cosmic forces that governed fermentation and transformation. The final years of Prince Kamawasat's life were spent in the sacred brewing chambers that had become his permanent residence, tending to fermentation processes that he seemed to understand at levels that transcended ordinary technical knowledge. He continued to create ceremonial beers for the most important religious festivals and state occasions, beverages that consistently exceeded the potency and effectiveness of anything that had been produced before his transformation. Yet his ability to communicate in ordinary language gradually diminished, replaced by a form of expression that incorporated the rhythmic patterns of fermentation itself. Speech that somehow conveyed technical information about brewing processes while remaining largely incomprehensible to anyone who lacked similar exposure to the consciousness-altering effects of sacred beer. The death of Prince Kamawasat, when it finally came, was as extraordinary as his life had been.
Rather than succumbing to disease or age-related decline, he simply failed to emerge from his brewing chambers one morning, found by his assistants in a state that witnesses described as peaceful transcendence rather than ordinary death. His body showed no signs of illness or injury, but rather appeared to have been preserved by the alcohol and psychoactive substances that had sustained him for so many years. Most remarkably, the fermentation vessels in his chamber continued to bubble and ferment for days after his death, as if his presence had somehow become permanently integrated with the brewing processes he had tended with such devotion. The funeral of Prince Kamawasat required the use of brewing techniques that he himself had developed, creating a funeral beer that incorporated some of the remaining eternal brew from his father's funeral ceremony. The participants in his funeral rites reported experiencing visions of the deceased prince continuing his brewing work in the afterlife, tending to fermentation vessels that produced the nectar consumed by gods, and providing guidance for the living brewing masters who would carry on his traditions. These visions were so consistent and detailed that they became incorporated into Egyptian religious doctrine, establishing Prince Kamawasat as the patron deity of brewers and the divine guardian of fermentation knowledge. The legacy of Prince Kamawasat's extraordinary life and ultimate transformation through brewing mastery continued to influence Egyptian civilization long after his death.
The techniques he developed for creating beverages of unprecedented potency became the foundation for ceremonial brewing practices that were maintained in the most sacred temple complexes for centuries. The consciousness-altering experiences that he achieved through regular consumption of sacred beer established precedents for spiritual practices that treated fermentation not merely as a practical skill, but as a pathway to divine enlightenment. The brewing chambers where Prince Kamawasat spent his final years became pilgrimage sites for master brewers from throughout Egypt and beyond, locations where fermentation knowledge was believed to be directly accessible through communion with the prince's lingering spiritual presence. The vessels he used for his most sacred brewing projects were preserved as religious relics, containers that were believed to retain some of the extraordinary fermentation properties that had enabled him to create the eternal brew. Even centuries after his death, these vessels were occasionally used for the most important ceremonial brewing projects, producing beverages that maintained some of the overwhelming potency that had characterized the prince's greatest achievements. As we witness the final moments of Prince Kamawasat's earthly existence, surrounded by the gentle sounds of fermentation that had provided the soundtrack to his transformed consciousness, we see the ultimate expression of ancient Egyptian brewing culture's potential to facilitate human transcendence.
In the flickering light of oil lamps that have burned continuously throughout his vigil, among vessels that continue their mysterious transformations even after their tender's departure, the prince's legacy embodies the profound truth that in the hands of true masters, brewing represented not merely the creation of intoxicating beverages, but the practical application of divine knowledge that could transform grain into spirit, consciousness into transcendence, and mortal understanding into communion with the eternal forces that govern all transformation throughout the cosmos.
Let us drift now from the documented chronicles of royal brewing mastery into the shadowed realm of archaeological mystery, where modern excavations continue to unearth evidence of brewing practices so sophisticated and powerful that they challenge our fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian capabilities. Deep beneath the shifting sands of the Saqqara necropolis, where the stepped pyramid of Djoser rises like a geometric mountain from the desert floor, recent discoveries have revealed brewing installations that suggest the creation of beverages far more potent and complex than anything previously imagined by scholars of ancient fermentation. The discovery began in the early morning hours of a December day in 1987, when a routine archaeological survey using ground-penetrating radar detected anomalous void spaces beneath what appeared to be unremarkable sand dunes, approximately 2 kilometers southeast of the main pyramid complex. The radar signatures suggested a network of chambers and corridors that had somehow escaped the attention of archaeologists for over a century of intensive excavation in the area.
When the excavation team finally broke through the sealed entrance, they found themselves confronting evidence of brewing operations that had been deliberately hidden and preserved with a level of care that suggested their contents were considered more precious than gold or precious stones. The first chamber the archaeologists entered contained row upon row of ceramic brewing vessels, each one larger than a person, and covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that proved to be brewing formulas of unprecedented complexity and detail. Unlike the relatively simple brewing instructions found in other Egyptian sites, these texts included precise measurements, timing specifications, and ingredient lists that incorporated substances from across the known ancient world. Most remarkably, many of the inscriptions included warnings about the extreme potency of the beverages being described, with repeated references to beers that could separate the soul from the body and grant mortals the vision of gods. The preservation conditions within these sealed chambers had created an archaeological treasure trove that provided unprecedented insight into the most advanced brewing practices of ancient Egypt. The dry desert air and complete isolation from light and moisture had maintained organic materials in states of preservation that bordered on the miraculous. Dried grains still retained enough cellular structure for modern analysis to determine their exact species and origin, while residues in brewing vessels contained traces of ingredients that revealed the extraordinary sophistication of ancient Egyptian fermentation chemistry.
Among the most startling discoveries were ceramic vessels that still contained dried residues of what appeared to be the actual beer produced in these hidden chambers thousands of years ago. When these residues were subjected to modern chemical analysis, the results revealed alcohol concentrations that exceeded anything found in previously analyzed ancient Egyptian beer samples. Gas chromatography and mass spectrometry detected not only alcohol levels approaching 60% by volume, but complex arrays of psychoactive compounds that suggested the systematic use of consciousness-altering plants in concentrations that would be considered extremely dangerous by modern standards. The brewing equipment found in these chambers demonstrated technological sophistication that challenged conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities. Temperature-controlled fermentation systems used precisely engineered ceramic chambers that could maintain optimal brewing conditions through ingenious passive cooling systems that channeled underground air currents. Filtration apparatus incorporated multiple stages of refinement using materials ranging from fine woven linen to powdered precious stones, creating beverages of unprecedented purity and potency. Most remarkably, several vessels appeared to have been designed for distillation processes that could concentrate alcohol far beyond what normal fermentation could achieve. The hieroglyphic texts found throughout the complex revealed that these chambers had been operated by a secret society of master brewers who called themselves the Servants of Eternal Intoxication, a group apparently dedicated to pushing the boundaries of fermentation science in service of religious and mystical goals.
The inscriptions described brewing techniques that combined practical knowledge with magical practices, creating beverages that were intended not merely to intoxicate, but to facilitate communication with deceased ancestors, divine beings, and cosmic forces that governed the fundamental processes of existence. One of the most mysterious aspects of this archaeological discovery was evidence suggesting that the brewing operations had continued far longer than conventional Egyptian chronology would indicate as possible. Carbon dating of organic materials found in different layers of the complex suggested continuous use spanning nearly 2,000 years from the Old Kingdom through the Roman period. This timeline implied the existence of brewing traditions that somehow survived political upheavals, foreign invasions, and cultural transformations that had supposedly ended traditional Egyptian religious practices. The deeper chambers of the complex contained brewing installations that appeared to have been designed for the production of beverages intended for specific mystical and religious purposes. One chamber contained vessels inscribed with formulas for beer of the dead, beverages so potent that their consumption was described as temporarily granting the drinker the consciousness of deceased individuals. Another area was dedicated to the production of solar beer, brews that incorporated ingredients and timing designed to align the fermentation process with astronomical phenomena, creating beverages that were consumed during solar eclipses and other celestially significant events.
Perhaps the most extraordinary discovery was a chamber that appeared to have been designed as a combination brewery and laboratory, where the ancient brewers conducted systematic experiments in fermentation science that anticipated modern biochemistry by thousands of years. Detailed records carved into stone tablets documented the effects of different fermentation temperatures, ingredient combinations, and timing variations on both alcohol content and psychoactive properties. These ancient brewing scientists had clearly understood concepts like optimal yeast nutrition, pH control, and the complex interactions between different types of psychoactive compounds that modern brewing science has only recently begun to appreciate. The ingredient storage areas within the complex revealed the truly international scope of ancient Egyptian brewing operations at their most advanced levels. Sealed ceramic jars contained the desiccated remains of substances that had been transported from across the ancient world specifically for use in brewing applications. Cinnamon and cardamom from distant Asian kingdoms, exotic mushrooms from European forests, psychoactive cacti from unknown Western lands, and dozens of other ingredients that suggested trade networks far more extensive than conventional ancient history acknowledges. One of the most puzzling discoveries was a series of chambers that appeared to have been designed for aging beer over extremely long periods, some containing vessels with inscriptions indicating fermentation periods measured in decades rather than months.
The technology for maintaining these long-term fermentation processes included sophisticated air circulation systems, temperature control mechanisms, and even what appeared to be primitive pressure regulation systems that prevented the explosive failure of vessels containing highly carbonated beverages. The alcohol content of residues from these long-aged brews exceeded anything previously thought possible through fermentation alone. The most disturbing aspect of the archaeological findings was evidence suggesting that the most potent brewing formulas had been deliberately hidden or destroyed before the chambers were finally sealed. Several areas showed signs of systematic removal of inscribed texts, while certain brewing vessels appeared to have been deliberately broken and their contents destroyed. The inscriptions that remained included repeated warnings about the dangers of the most powerful brewing techniques, with references to brewers who had been consumed by their own creations, and beverages so potent that their consumption could result in permanent separation of consciousness from physical form. The skeletal remains found in the deepest chambers of the complex provided haunting evidence of the ultimate effects that these extraordinarily potent brews could have on human physiology and consciousness. Several bodies were discovered in positions that suggested peaceful death during meditation or ritual consumption, with no evidence of violence or disease. Chemical analysis of bone samples revealed alcohol and psychoactive substance concentrations that would have been immediately fatal to anyone without extensive prior conditioning through gradual exposure to increasingly potent brews. More mysteriously,
Some of the skeletal remains showed signs of preservation that exceeded what the environmental conditions of the chambers should have been able to achieve. The high alcohol content of the brewing environment appeared to have created mummification effects that maintained soft tissue and even some internal organs in states of preservation that rivaled the most sophisticated Egyptian mummification techniques. The faces of these ancient brewers retained peaceful expressions that suggested their deaths had been transcendent experiences rather than traumatic endings. The discovery of extensive written records in these hidden chambers provided unprecedented insight into the psychological and spiritual effects that regular consumption of extremely potent beer had on the ancient Egyptian consciousness. Personal accounts carved into chamber walls described experiences that modern readers might interpret as drug-induced hallucinations, but which the ancient writers clearly understood as genuine communications with divine forces and deceased ancestors. These texts revealed that the most advanced brewing practitioners had developed tolerance levels that allowed them to function normally while consuming beverages that would render modern drinkers unconscious within minutes. The architectural design of the chambers themselves suggested that the brewing operations had been conducted in an atmosphere of religious reverence that treated fermentation as a sacred act comparable to the most important temple rituals. The walls were decorated with scenes depicting brewing deities presiding over fermentation vessels, while carefully positioned alcoves held statues of gods and goddesses associated with transformation, death, and rebirth.
The entire complex had been designed as a temple dedicated to the divine forces believed to govern the mysterious processes that transformed grain into substances capable of altering human consciousness and facilitating communication between mortal and divine realms. The final mystery of this archaeological discovery lies in the question of why such sophisticated brewing knowledge was eventually abandoned and deliberately concealed. The latest inscriptions found in the complex date to approximately the 3rd century CE, suggesting that the operations continued well into the Roman period, when traditional Egyptian religious practices were supposedly in decline. The final texts include references to the coming darkness and the need to preserve brewing knowledge for those who will understand in times yet to come, suggesting that the master brewers foresaw the end of their traditions and took deliberate steps to ensure that their accumulated wisdom might someday be rediscovered. As modern archaeologists continue to explore these hidden chambers and analyze their extraordinary contents, they confront evidence of brewing capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about ancient Egyptian technology and consciousness. The sophistication of fermentation science, the international scope of ingredient procurement, and the systematic experimentation with consciousness-altering substances reveal a civilization whose understanding of brewing extended far beyond simple beverage production into realms that modern science is only beginning to explore. In the darkness of these sealed chambers, surrounded by the tools and records of brewing masters whose names are lost to history, we encounter mysteries that suggest ancient Egyptian beer represented not merely sustenance or recreation, but a technology for exploring the furthest reaches of human consciousness and its relationship to cosmic forces that remain largely unknown to our modern understanding. The decipherment of the hieroglyphic texts found within the hidden Saqqara brewing chambers has revealed one of the most extraordinary religious cults in ancient Egyptian history, a secret society that treated the consumption of extremely potent beer not as mere indulgence, but as the central sacrament in a sophisticated system of spiritual practice designed to achieve permanent alteration of human consciousness. The inscriptions describe initiation rituals, progressive training programs, and ultimate transcendence ceremonies that used beverages of unprecedented potency to facilitate what the practitioners clearly believed was actual transformation of human beings into divine entities. The cult, which referred to itself in the secret texts as the eternal brewers of the sacred threshold, operated according to principles that combined practical fermentation science with mystical practices derived from the most ancient Egyptian religious traditions. New initiates underwent preparation periods lasting several years, during which they gradually built tolerance to increasingly potent brews while simultaneously studying fermentation science, astronomical calculation,
and the psychological techniques necessary to maintain consciousness during extreme intoxication.
The training process was designed to prepare practitioners for consumption of beverages so powerful that untrained individuals would likely die from alcohol poisoning within hours of consumption. The hieroglyphic records describe a graduated series of brewing formulas that corresponded to different levels of initiation within the cult, each designed to produce specific psychological and spiritual effects while preparing the practitioner for even more powerful experiences. The first-level brews, consumed by novice initiates, contained alcohol concentrations around 20%, combined with mild psychoactive herbs that induced heightened sensory perception and emotional openness. These gateway beers were consumed during group ceremonies that emphasized community bonding and the sharing of brewing knowledge, creating the social foundation necessary for more advanced practices. The intermediate-level formulas pushed alcohol content to 30%, while incorporating consciousness-altering substances that could induce profound alterations in perception of time and space. Practitioners at this level reported experiences of communicating with deceased master brewers, receiving technical guidance that enabled them to create increasingly sophisticated fermentation projects. The inscriptions describe systematic programs for building tolerance to these intermediate brews, with detailed schedules for gradually increasing consumption over periods of months or years, until the practitioner could function normally while under the influence of beverages that would render ordinary people unconscious.
The advanced brewing formulas represented the cult's most closely guarded secrets, creating beverages with alcohol content approaching 50% while incorporating arrays of psychoactive substances that the texts describe as capable of dissolving the boundaries between mortal and divine consciousness. These threshold beers were consumed only during the most sacred ceremonies, rituals that apparently lasted for days and resulted in experiences that practitioners interpreted as temporary death and rebirth. Actual transformation from human to divine status that could be maintained through continued consumption of the sacred brews. The most extraordinary aspect of these decoded texts is their description of the ultimate goal of the cult's practices, which involved the systematic replacement of normal human consciousness with what they termed eternal brewing consciousness, a state in which the practitioner's identity became permanently merged with the divine forces that governed fermentation. Individuals who achieved this ultimate transformation were described as having transcended the normal limitations of human existence, gaining the ability to perceive fermentation processes at levels that bordered on the supernatural, while maintaining conscious awareness even during the consumption of the most potent brews the cult could produce. The archaeological evidence suggests that many practitioners did indeed achieve extraordinary levels of adaptation to alcohol consumption that exceed modern medical understanding of human physiological capabilities.
Chemical analysis of bone samples from the chamber skeletons reveals chronic exposure to alcohol and psychoactive substances at concentrations that should have resulted in organ failure and neurological damage, yet the bone structure and dental remains suggest individuals who maintained excellent health throughout extended periods of extreme intoxication. This apparent physiological adaptation may have resulted from gradual conditioning combined with the nutritional support provided by the thick, vitamin-rich consistency of ancient Egyptian beer. The cult's brewing calendar reveals sophisticated understanding of astronomical and seasonal cycles that influenced both fermentation conditions and the psychological effects of consuming sacred beers. Different brews were created during specific lunar phases, astrological alignments, and seasonal transitions, with the timing designed to optimize both fermentation chemistry and the consciousness-altering experiences of the practitioners. The most powerful ceremonial brews were prepared during solar eclipses and other rare astronomical events, when the cult believed that cosmic conditions facilitated maximum spiritual transformation potential. The ingredient procurement networks
required for the cult's most advanced brewing projects, reveal international connections that extended far beyond conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian trade relationships. Detailed records describe expeditions to obtain rare psychoactive plants from distant lands, including substances that appear to have been transported from locations as far away as the Americas and Australia. These exotic ingredients were incorporated into brewing formulas according to precise specifications that suggest sophisticated understanding of how different psychoactive compounds interact with alcohol and with each other to produce specific consciousness-altering effects.
The most disturbing aspect of the decoded texts involves descriptions of practitioners who apparently pushed the boundaries of sacred intoxication beyond safe limits, resulting in permanent dissociation from ordinary reality that the cult interpreted as successful transcendence to divine status. These transcended ones were revered within the cult as living gods, individuals whose consciousness had become so thoroughly merged with brewing forces that they could no longer function in normal human society, but served as oracles and guides for other practitioners seeking similar transformation. The chamber walls contain carved portraits of several of these transcended individuals, depicted with serene expressions and surrounded by brewing symbols that suggest their consciousness had become permanently integrated with fermentation processes. The inscriptions describe their ability to perceive the progress of fermentation in dozens of vessels simultaneously, to predict the effects of specific brews on different individuals, and to create new formulas through direct intuitive understanding rather than trial and error experimentation. Yet these same texts also hint at the isolation and otherworldliness that resulted from such extreme transformation, with references to transcended practitioners who could no longer communicate effectively with ordinary humans. The cult's systematic documentation of brewing effects on human consciousness provides unprecedented insight into the psychological and physiological changes that result from regular consumption of extremely potent alcoholic beverages.
The texts describe progressive stages of adaptation that begin with enhanced sensory perception and emotional sensitivity, proceed through periods of expanded awareness and mystical experience, and culminate in states of consciousness that practitioners interpreted as permanent merger with divine forces. Modern readers might interpret these accounts as describing advanced stages of alcoholism, but the detailed records suggest experiences that transcended simple intoxication and approached what could only be described as systematic exploration of altered consciousness. The ritual procedures described in the chamber inscriptions reveal the extraordinary precautions the cult took to ensure safe consumption of their most dangerous brews, including detailed protocols for preparation, consumption, and recovery that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of both the benefits and risks of extreme intoxication. Practitioners consumed sacred beers only in specially prepared environments, under the supervision of experienced guides, and according to carefully timed schedules designed to maximize spiritual benefits while minimizing physical dangers. The texts include detailed instructions for recognizing signs of alcohol poisoning, techniques for maintaining consciousness during extreme intoxication, and emergency procedures for assisting practitioners who had consumed more than their tolerance levels could handle. The cult's understanding of individual variation in alcohol tolerance led to the development of personalized brewing programs that created different formulations for practitioners based on their physical constitution, spiritual development, and specific goals within the organization.
Some individuals were trained to consume the most potent brews and serve as intermediaries between human and divine consciousness, while others specialized in creating and maintaining the fermentation cultures that made such powerful beverages possible. This specialization created a complex hierarchy within the cult that combined practical brewing expertise with spiritual authority in ways that challenged conventional distinctions between technological skill and religious wisdom. The final inscriptions in the chambers describe the cult's awareness that their practices represented dangerous exploration of human consciousness limits that could result in permanent psychological damage or death. Yet they continued their work because they believed it provided the only reliable method for achieving the spiritual transcendence that represented the ultimate goal of human existence. The texts include philosophical discussions about the balance between spiritual growth and physical safety, with practitioners clearly understanding that their quest for divine consciousness required accepting risks that most individuals would consider unacceptable. As we absorb the implications of these decoded mysteries, standing in chambers where ancient practitioners pushed the boundaries of human consciousness through systematic consumption of beverages more potent than anything our modern world produces, we confront questions about the ultimate potential and dangers of using fermented beverages as tools for spiritual exploration.
The cult of sacred intoxication represents both the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian brewing sophistication and a cautionary tale about the risks inherent in treating consciousness alteration as a pathway to transcendence, leaving us to wonder whether their practitioners achieved genuine spiritual transformation or simply succumbed to the seductive power of substances that promise divine experience while potentially destroying the human consciousness they sought to transcend. The most haunting mystery within the Saqqara brewing chambers lies in the evidence surrounding the cult's final ceremony, an event so extraordinary and disturbing that the archaeological team initially struggled to comprehend what their excavation had uncovered. In the deepest chamber of the complex, archaeologists discovered the remains of what appeared to be the cult's ultimate ritual, a ceremony that the hieroglyphic texts refer to as the final crossing, an attempt to achieve permanent transcendence through consumption of a brew so potent that it represented the absolute limit of what fermentation science could produce while maintaining any connection to recognizable beer. The chamber itself had been prepared with unprecedented care and reverence, its walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions that combined brewing formulas with religious texts normally reserved for pharaonic burial ceremonies.
The floor was arranged in a perfect circle, with brewing vessels positioned according to astronomical alignments that corresponded to a rare celestial event that occurred approximately once every 1,460 years, when the heliacal rising of Sirius coincided with specific planetary alignments that the ancient Egyptians believed opened direct communication channels between mortal and divine realms. At the center of this ceremonial arrangement sat the largest brewing vessel ever discovered in ancient Egypt, a ceramic masterpiece that stood over 3 meters tall and was inscribed with warnings so dire that modern translators initially hesitated to publish their complete translations. The inscriptions described a brew called the Wine of Eternity, created through fermentation processes that pushed alcohol concentration beyond 60%, while incorporating psychoactive substances in quantities that the texts acknowledged would likely result in the permanent departure of human consciousness from physical form. The preparation of this final brew had apparently required months of effort by the cult's most experienced practitioners, combining ingredients that represented the accumulated exotic substances from decades of international procurement. The vessel contained traces of compounds that modern analysis struggles to identify, including psychoactive alkaloids from plants that may now be extinct, fermentation enhancers that appeared to have been created through alchemical processes that remain mysterious, and alcohol concentrations that approached the theoretical limits of what biological fermentation could achieve.
The skeletal remains found around this central vessel tell a story that is simultaneously fascinating and deeply disturbing, revealing the ultimate fate of practitioners who chose to participate in what they clearly understood would be their final human experience. 23 complete skeletons were arranged in concentric circles around the brewing vessel, each positioned in meditation postures that suggested peaceful, voluntary participation rather than coerced sacrifice. Chemical analysis of bone samples revealed alcohol and psychoactive substance concentrations that exceeded anything previously found in ancient remains, levels that would have been immediately fatal to anyone without extensive prior conditioning. More remarkably, the preservation state of these remains exceeded what the environmental conditions should have been able to achieve, with several bodies showing signs of natural mummification that appeared to result from the extreme alcohol saturation of their tissues. The facial expressions visible on preserved soft tissue suggested that death had occurred during states of profound transcendence rather than suffering, with serene smiles and peaceful eye positions that indicated the final moments had been experienced as spiritual triumph rather than physical trauma. The hieroglyphic records found throughout the chamber describe the months of preparation that preceded this final ceremony, including detailed accounts of the psychological and spiritual conditioning required for practitioners to voluntarily consume beverages that they knew would end their physical existence while potentially facilitating their permanent merger with divine consciousness.
The texts reveal sophisticated understanding of both the pharmacological effects of extreme intoxication and the psychological mechanisms that allow individuals to approach voluntary death as spiritual transformation rather than termination. The brewing process itself represented the culmination of everything the cult had learned about fermentation science, consciousness alteration, and the relationship between physical substances and spiritual transcendence. The wine of eternity was created through a fermentation process that lasted over a year, using yeast cultures that had been maintained and refined for centuries, ingredients that required years to properly prepare, and timing that coordinated the biological processes of fermentation with astronomical events that the practitioners believed would maximize the spiritual potency of their final creation. The texts describe the gradual assembly of participants for this ultimate ceremony, with practitioners arriving from secret brewing installations throughout Egypt and beyond, bringing with them the results of their own advanced fermentation experiments and their personal preparations for voluntary transcendence. The chamber inscriptions include biographical sketches of several participants, revealing individuals who had devoted their entire adult lives to exploring the limits of consciousness through sacred intoxication, and who viewed this final ceremony as the natural culmination of decades of spiritual and scientific exploration.
The actual consumption of the wine of eternity appears to have been conducted according to ritual procedures that treated the act not as suicide, but as graduation to a higher form of existence, with participants consuming carefully measured portions while chanting formulas designed to maintain conscious awareness during the transition from physical to spiritual form. The texts describe experiences that participants apparently underwent during the final ceremony, including visions of deceased cult members, communication with brewing deities, and awareness of cosmic processes that governed the transformation of matter into spirit throughout the universe. The most mysterious aspect of this final ceremony lies in evidence suggesting that the ritual may have achieved its intended spiritual goals in ways that transcend normal understanding of death and consciousness. Several chamber inscriptions appear to have been carved after the ceremony took place, describing ongoing communication with the transcended participants and providing brewing guidance that enabled surviving cult members to continue their work for several more decades. The handwriting analysis of these later inscriptions suggests they were created by individuals whose consciousness had been profoundly altered by their proximity to the final ceremony, possibly through exposure to vapors from the wine of eternity, or through psychological effects of witnessing such extreme spiritual transformation.
The chamber also contained evidence of subsequent visits by surviving cult members who apparently continued to use the space for brewing activities long after the final ceremony had concluded, treating the location as a sacred site where the boundary between physical and spiritual realms had been permanently altered. These later activities included the creation of commemorative brews that incorporated small amounts of residue from the wine of eternity, creating beverages that were believed to facilitate communication with the transcended practitioners and to provide guidance for continuing the cult's work. The final inscriptions in the chamber describe the gradual decline of the cult, as knowledge of their most advanced techniques died with the participants in the final ceremony, leaving surviving members unable to replicate the extraordinary brewing achievements of their predecessors.
The texts express both pride in the spiritual accomplishments of the transcended practitioners and sorrow at the loss of brewing knowledge that had required centuries to develop and could not be easily transmitted to new generations of practitioners. The archaeological evidence suggests that the cult continued to operate on a reduced scale for several more generations, creating sophisticated brews that maintained some of the consciousness-altering properties of their predecessors' work, while lacking the ultimate transcendence potential of the lost advanced formulas. The later brewing installations show clear decline in both technical sophistication and spiritual ambition, as if the surviving practitioners understood that they could no longer achieve the extraordinary states of consciousness that had been accessible to the transcended masters.
The mystery of what actually happened to the consciousness of the final ceremony participants remains one of the most intriguing questions raised by the Saqqara discoveries, challenging conventional assumptions about the relationship between extreme intoxication and spiritual experience. The skeletal evidence clearly demonstrates that the participants died from alcohol and psychoactive substance consumption. Yet the circumstances of their deaths and the subsequent behavior of surviving cult members suggest experiences that transcended simple pharmacological effects and approached genuine spiritual transformation. Modern analysis of the chamber environment has detected residual traces of psychoactive compounds that continue to affect sensitive individuals who spend extended time in the space, creating mild, altered consciousness effects that some researchers interpret as evidence that the final ceremony created permanent changes in the location's atmosphere. Archaeological team members have reported unusual dreams, enhanced sensory perception, and intuitive insights into brewing processes while working in the chamber, effects that may result from exposure to residual psychoactive substances or from psychological suggestion influenced by the extraordinary nature of their discoveries. The broader implications of the cult's ultimate ceremony extend far beyond archaeological curiosity, raising profound questions about the limits of human consciousness and the potential for chemical substances to facilitate genuine spiritual transcendence rather than mere temporary alteration of perception.
The practitioners clearly believed they were achieving permanent transformation of their essential nature, moving from human to divine consciousness through voluntary consumption of substances they knew would end their physical existence. Yet their preparations and final experiences suggest levels of spiritual sophistication that challenge dismissive explanations of their practices as mere addiction or delusion. The preservation of the chamber and its contents represents a time capsule that captures one of humanity's most extreme experiments in consciousness exploration, a systematic attempt to use fermentation science and sacred intoxication to transcend the normal limitations of human existence and achieve permanent merger with cosmic forces. Whether their ultimate ceremony represented successful spiritual transformation or tragic self-destruction remains an open question that challenges our understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the relationship between chemical substances and transcendent experience. As we stand in this sacred chamber, surrounded by the remains of practitioners who chose to risk everything in pursuit of ultimate spiritual transformation, we confront the profound mystery of what human consciousness might be capable of achieving when pushed to its absolute limits through systematic consumption of substances more potent than anything our modern world considers safe or legal.
The cult of sacred intoxication achieved brewing mastery that enabled them to create beverages approaching the theoretical limits of fermentation science. Yet their ultimate goal remained the ancient human quest for transcendence that continues to drive spiritual exploration across all cultures and historical periods, leaving us to wonder whether their final ceremony represents humanity's greatest spiritual achievement or its most tragic cautionary tale about the seductive dangers of seeking divine experience through chemical means. Let us drift now from the extreme mysteries of secret cults to the rarefied atmosphere of Egyptian aristocracy, where brewing practices revealed the profound social stratification that characterized one of history's most hierarchical civilizations.
in the sprawling villa of Amenhotep Hui, a wealthy grain merchant whose family had accumulated vast fortunes through 3 generations of strategic Nile commerce, we encounter brewing operations that demonstrate how extreme wealth transformed the consumption of beer from daily necessity into elaborate performance of social status and political power. The villa itself, situated on elevated ground overlooking the Nile near Memphis, represented architectural sophistication that rivaled royal palaces in its complexity and luxury. Within its walls, a dedicated brewing complex occupied an entire wing of the structure, employing over 40 specialized workers whose sole responsibility was creating beverages for the household's consumption and the elaborate entertaining that defined aristocratic social life.
Unlike the simple brewing operations we witnessed in village households, this was industrial-scale production that combined the most advanced fermentation techniques with theatrical presentation designed to demonstrate the family's wealth and cultural sophistication to their equally privileged peers. The master brewer who oversaw these operations, a man named Com Hesset, whose family had served wealthy households for over 2 centuries, possessed knowledge and skills that exceeded those of many temple priests in their complexity and esoteric nature. His training had begun in childhood and continued throughout his adult life, encompassing not only the technical aspects of creating beverages of unprecedented potency and refinement, but also the subtle arts of matching specific brews to particular social occasions, political objectives, and the psychological profiles of important guests who would be consuming his creations. The brewing facilities within the villa demonstrated technological capabilities that pushed ancient Egyptian fermentation science to its practical limits, utilizing equipment and techniques that remained closely guarded family secrets passed down through generations of master brewers. Temperature-controlled fermentation chambers used sophisticated ventilation systems and underground cooling channels that maintained optimal conditions year-round, while specialized filtration apparatus created beverages of crystalline clarity and potency that exceeded anything available to less wealthy consumers. The alcohol content of routine household beer consistently reached 25%, while special occasion brews could achieve concentrations approaching 40% through techniques that combined extended fermentation with primitive distillation processes.
The ingredients available to wealthy brewing operations revealed the vast networks of international trade that supported aristocratic lifestyles, with exotic substances arriving by caravan and river barge from the furthest reaches of the known world. Saffron from distant northern kingdoms provided both color and subtle psychoactive effects, while rare spices from eastern lands contributed complexity and potency to brews that were consumed not merely for sustenance but as expressions of cultural refinement and global influence. The cost of ingredients for a single batch of premium aristocratic beer often exceeded the annual income of entire peasant families, yet wealthy households considered such expense essential to maintaining their social position and political influence. The social rituals surrounding aristocratic beer consumption transformed drinking from simple ingestion into elaborate ceremonial performances that communicated complex messages about status, alliance, and political intention to carefully selected audiences. Evening gatherings in Amenhotep Hui's reception halls featured the presentation of multiple beer varieties, each served in precious metal vessels and accompanied by detailed explanations of the brewing techniques, ingredient origins, and intended psychological effects that guests were expected to appreciate and discuss with appropriate sophistication. The ability to distinguish between different brewing styles, to appreciate subtle variations in fermentation technique, and to consume large quantities of extremely potent beer while maintaining conversational eloquence became markers of aristocratic education and cultural refinement.
The servants who participated in these elaborate beer presentations underwent training that combined practical skills with theatrical performance, learning not only the technical aspects of proper serving technique, but also the subtle arts of reading social cues, managing intoxicated guests, and facilitating the complex negotiations that often accompanied aristocratic drinking sessions. The most skilled beer servers possessed encyclopedic knowledge of their master's brewing operations,
enabling them to provide detailed information about specific batches, while also monitoring guests' consumption levels and adjusting serving sizes to maintain optimal social atmospheres throughout extended evening entertainments. The physiological effects of consuming aristocratic beer on a regular basis created distinct physical and psychological characteristics that differentiated wealthy Egyptians from their less privileged contemporaries, establishing biological markers of social class that were immediately recognizable to experienced observers. The high alcohol content and nutritious consistency of premium beer provided superior nutrition compared to the grain-based diets of peasant populations, resulting in larger physical stature, healthier teeth, and enhanced longevity among aristocratic families. More subtly, the consciousness-altering effects of regular consumption of psychoactive brewing additives created psychological characteristics that wealthy Egyptians interpreted as evidence of their natural superiority to common people. The political dimensions of aristocratic brewing became apparent during state occasions and diplomatic gatherings, where the quality and potency of beer served communicated messages about Egypt's wealth, technological sophistication, and cultural dominance to foreign dignitaries and potential allies. Visiting rulers and ambassadors were presented with brewing achievements that exceeded anything their own civilizations could produce, creating psychological advantages that skilled Egyptian diplomats exploited to secure favorable trade agreements and political alliances. The overwhelming effects of Egyptian ceremonial beer on unprepared foreign dignitaries became legendary throughout the ancient world, enhancing Egypt's reputation for possessing supernatural capabilities that neighboring civilizations could neither understand nor replicate. The aristocratic brewing calendar coordinated production schedules with seasonal festivals, astronomical events, and political occasions to ensure optimal social and psychological impact during the most important gatherings of the Egyptian elite. Special batches were prepared months in advance for major celebrations, with fermentation timing calculated to achieve peak potency during specific ceremonies where maximum consciousness-altering effects would enhance the ritual significance of the occasions. The most prestigious brewing projects required year-long preparation periods, creating beverages that incorporated ingredients gathered during optimal seasonal conditions and fermentation processes that aligned with cosmic events believed to enhance spiritual potency. The training of aristocratic children in beer appreciation began during early adolescence and continued throughout their education, encompassing both practical knowledge about brewing techniques and cultural instruction in the social protocols that governed aristocratic drinking behavior. Young people learned to distinguish between different fermentation styles, to appreciate the subtle effects of various psychoactive additives, and to maintain sophisticated conversation while consuming beverages that would render untrained individuals unconscious within hours.
This educational process created generational continuity in aristocratic drinking culture, while also serving as a form of social screening that identified individuals capable of participating effectively in elite society. The economic implications of aristocratic brewing operations extended throughout Egyptian society, creating employment opportunities and market demand that supported entire industries devoted to luxury fermentation. Specialized craftsmen created the precious metal vessels, elaborate serving equipment, and decorative accessories that accompanied aristocratic beer consumption, while agricultural operations focused on producing the highest quality grains and herbs for wealthy brewing operations. The international trade networks required to supply exotic ingredients created diplomatic and commercial relationships that influenced Egypt's foreign policy and economic development throughout the ancient period. The medical understanding that developed around aristocratic beer consumption revealed sophisticated awareness of both the beneficial and dangerous effects of regular consumption of extremely potent alcoholic beverages, leading to the development of dietary and lifestyle modifications designed to maximize health benefits while minimizing potential damage from chronic high-level alcohol intake. Wealthy families employed personal physicians who specialized in managing the physiological effects of luxury beer consumption, providing treatments that combined herbal remedies, dietary supplements, and lifestyle recommendations to support optimal health despite regular intake of beverages that would prove toxic to less conditioned individuals. The psychological effects of aristocratic brewing culture created distinct personality characteristics and social behaviors that differentiated elite Egyptians from common people, establishing cultural patterns that influenced art, literature, and religious practices throughout Egyptian civilization.
The consciousness-altering effects of premium beer consumption enhanced creativity and philosophical speculation, while also creating psychological detachment from practical concerns that wealthy individuals interpreted as evidence of their natural fitness for leadership and cultural guidance. This aristocratic mindset, reinforced by daily consumption of consciousness-altering beverages, contributed to the development of Egyptian high culture while also creating social blind spots that potentially contributed to political instability during periods of economic stress. As evening approaches in Amenhotep Hui's villa and the elaborate preparations begin for another night of aristocratic entertainment, we observe the transformation of simple brewing into a complex performance of wealth, power, and cultural sophistication that reveals the profound ways that extreme social inequality shaped every aspect of ancient Egyptian life. The beer that flows from precious vessels into crystal cups represents not merely fermented grain, but liquid embodiment of political power, economic dominance, and cultural authority that differentiated the elite from common people as clearly as any physical barrier or legal restriction, creating a society in which access to consciousness-altering substances became both symbol and substance of social stratification that defined Egyptian civilization throughout its long history. Between the extremes of aristocratic excess and peasant necessity lay a world of craftsmen, scribes, and minor officials whose brewing practices revealed the complex social dynamics of Egypt's emerging middle classes, individuals who possessed sufficient wealth to transcend mere survival, yet lacked the resources to achieve true aristocratic status.
In the workshop district of Memphis, where skilled artisans created the goods that sustained Egyptian civilization's material prosperity, we encounter brewing operations that balanced practical necessity with social aspiration, creating beverages that provided both sustenance and carefully measured approximations of elite luxury. The master jeweler Ptahshepsis, whose workshop produced ornaments for wealthy merchants and minor nobles throughout the Memphis region, exemplified the middle-class approach to brewing that combined technical competence with economic constraint, creating sophisticated beverages that demonstrated cultural refinement while remaining within the financial limitations that defined his social position. His household brewing operations occupied a modest but well-designed space adjacent to his jewelry workshop, utilizing equipment and techniques that represented scaled-down versions of aristocratic brewing systems adapted to middle-class budgets and spatial limitations. The brewing knowledge that Ptahshepsis had acquired over 2 decades of careful observation and experimentation revealed the sophisticated information networks that connected Egypt's artisan communities, enabling craftsmen to share techniques, ingredients, and innovations that gradually elevated middle-class brewing standards throughout the civilization. Unlike aristocratic brewers who guarded their secrets jealously, or peasant families whose brewing knowledge remained limited by economic constraints, middle-class practitioners participated in informal networks that facilitated technical exchange and collaborative improvement of fermentation techniques across different craft specializations. The ingredients available to middle-class brewing operations reflected both the expanded purchasing power that distinguished artisans from common laborers and the economic constraints that prevented them from accessing the exotic substances that characterized aristocratic beer production. Ptahshepsis could afford higher quality barley and emmer wheat than peasant brewers, along with modest quantities of imported spices and psychoactive herbs that enhanced both flavor and consciousness-altering effects. Yet his ingredient budgets required careful planning and strategic purchasing that balanced quality improvement against other household expenses and business investments. The alcohol content achieved by skilled middle-class brewers typically ranged from 15 to 20%, significantly exceeding peasant beer potency, while remaining well below the extreme concentrations that characterized aristocratic productions. This middle range of alcohol strength created beverages that provided substantial consciousness-altering effects without the overwhelming intoxication that could interfere with the precise manual work that sustained artisan livelihoods, enabling craftsmen to maintain optimal productivity while enjoying the psychological benefits of mild but consistent intoxication throughout their working days. The social function served by middle-class brewing extended beyond simple sustenance to encompass complex negotiations of status, aspiration, and community solidarity that defined artisan identity within Egyptian social hierarchies. Evening gatherings in Hatshepsut's courtyard featured presentations of his household's brewing achievements to fellow craftsmen, potential customers, and social superiors, creating opportunities for business networking, technical exchange, and careful displays of cultural sophistication that might facilitate advancement into higher social circles. The training required to achieve middle-class brewing competence represented a significant investment of time and resources that competed with other demands on artisan attention and income. Yet most skilled craftsmen considered such knowledge essential to maintaining their social position and economic opportunities.
Hatshepsut had spent years learning to distinguish between different fermentation stages, to calculate optimal ingredient proportions, and to manage the timing and temperature control necessary for producing consistently high-quality beverages, knowledge that enhanced both his household's quality of life and his reputation within the artisan community. The equipment used in middle-class brewing operations demonstrated the innovative adaptation and technological creativity that characterized Egyptian artisan culture, with craftsmen applying their professional skills to create brewing apparatus that maximized results within economic constraints. Hatshepsut had fabricated specialized fermentation vessels using ceramic techniques developed in his jewelry workshop, while incorporating temperature control systems adapted from metalworking processes to create brewing conditions that approached aristocratic standards at a fraction of the cost. The seasonal rhythms that governed middle-class brewing reflected the complex balance between economic opportunity and household management that defined artisan life, with brewing schedules coordinated to take advantage of optimal ingredient prices while ensuring adequate beverage supplies during the most demanding periods of craft production. The highest quality brews were typically prepared during slack periods in the jewelry business, when Hatshepsut could devote extended attention to fermentation processes, while routine household beer was produced according to standardized procedures that required minimal supervision during busy craft seasons. The physiological effects of regular middle-class beer consumption created distinct health and psychological characteristics that differentiated skilled artisans from both aristocratic excess and peasant deprivation, establishing biological markers of middle-class status that were visible to experienced social observers.
The moderate but consistent alcohol intake, provided by quality middle-class beer, enhanced creative thinking and manual dexterity, while avoiding the physical damage associated with aristocratic consumption levels, creating optimal conditions for the precise work that sustained artisan prosperity. The economic implications of middle-class brewing operations extended throughout Egyptian society, creating market demand for intermediate quality ingredients and equipment that supported specialized producers and distributors serving artisan communities. The purchasing power of skilled craftsmen enabled them to access imported spices and brewing additives that remained beyond peasant reach, while lacking the resources for the most exotic substances used in aristocratic productions, creating distinct market segments that influenced trade patterns and agricultural specialization throughout the Egyptian economy. The cultural significance of middle-class brewing achievement represented an important pathway for social mobility and status enhancement within Egyptian society, enabling skilled artisans to demonstrate cultural sophistication and technical competence that might facilitate advancement into merchant or administrative classes. Hatshepsut's reputation as a capable brewer enhanced his standing within the artisan community, while also providing opportunities to interact with wealthy customers and officials who appreciated quality brewing and might offer business opportunities or social connections that could benefit his family's long-term prospects. The psychological effects of middle-class brewing culture created personality characteristics and social behaviors that distinguished artisan communities from both aristocratic detachment and peasant submission, fostering attitudes of self-reliance, technical pride, and moderate ambition that contributed to Egyptian civilization's material prosperity and cultural achievement.
The consciousness-altering effects of quality middle-class beer enhanced creative problem-solving and collaborative interaction while maintaining the practical focus necessary for skilled craft production, creating optimal psychological conditions for innovation and artistic achievement. The family dynamics within middle-class brewing households revealed the complex gender roles and generational relationships that characterized artisan society, with brewing knowledge and responsibilities distributed among family members according to patterns that balanced economic efficiency with social tradition. Chalice's wife managed routine brewing operations, while he focused on special batches and equipment maintenance, while their adolescent children learned brewing skills alongside jewelry techniques as part of their preparation for adult economic and social responsibilities. As we observe Chalice and his family in their evening brewing activities, carefully measuring ingredients and monitoring fermentation processes with the same precision they applied to their jewelry work, we witness the complex social dynamics that enabled Egyptian civilization to develop and maintain the sophisticated middle classes that sustained its economic prosperity and cultural achievements throughout centuries of political change and economic challenge, creating a society where brewing competence served as both practical necessity and symbol of social advancement within the complex hierarchies that defined ancient Egyptian life.
As our journey through the hierarchies of ancient Egyptian brewing culture draws to its gentle conclusion, we return to where we began, among the mud brick houses and simple courtyards where the vast majority of Egyptians lived out their lives in quiet dignity, sustained by brewing practices that, while lacking the exotic ingredients and elaborate equipment of their social superiors, possessed a profound wisdom and resilience that enabled their civilization to endure for over 3 millennia. Here, in the humble household of Seneb, an elderly grain farmer whose family had worked the same fertile plots along the Nile for 6 generations, we discover that the most fundamental truths about ancient Egyptian beer lay not in aristocratic excess or middle-class aspiration, but in the patient accumulation of practical knowledge that transformed simple ingredients into liquid sustenance capable of supporting human life and consciousness under the most challenging conditions. The brewing knowledge that Seneb and his wife Heket had inherited from their ancestors and refined through decades of daily practice represented a form of biotechnology so sophisticated and well adapted to local conditions that it required no exotic ingredients, complex equipment, or elaborate theoretical understanding to produce beverages that consistently provided both nutritional sustenance and consciousness-altering effects, sufficient to ease the harsh realities of agricultural labor.
Their brewing vessels were simple clay pots shaped by village potters from local Nile mud. Their ingredients came from their own fields and the plants that grew wild along the riverbank. Yet the beer they produced daily possessed alcohol content ranging from 8 to 15%, while maintaining the thick, nutritious consistency that provided essential calories, vitamins, and minerals that their grain-heavy diet might otherwise lack. The fermentation cultures that bubbled quietly in Seneb's brewing corner had been maintained by his family line for generations beyond memory, passed down from mother to daughter-in-law through an unbroken chain of daily care and feeding that created yeast strains uniquely adapted to local conditions and family preferences. These microscopic organisms, carefully nurtured with offerings of fresh grain and honey, represented living connections to ancestral knowledge that enabled each new generation to produce beverages that carried forward not only nutritional and intoxicating properties, but subtle flavoring and consciousness-altering characteristics that created continuity of experience across centuries of family history. The daily rhythm of brewing in Seneb's household revealed the profound integration of fermentation into the fundamental patterns of peasant life, with brewing activities coordinated to complement agricultural work, seasonal celebrations, and family responsibilities in ways that maximized both practical efficiency and social cohesion.
Morning brewing preparations began before dawn, when Heket would check fermentation progress and prepare fresh batches, while Seneb tended to livestock and prepared for field work, creating a collaborative household routine that ensured constant availability of fresh beer while distributing brewing responsibilities according to other demands on family time and energy. The ingredients available to peasant brewing operations demonstrated remarkable creativity and botanical knowledge that enabled common families to produce beverages of surprising complexity and effectiveness, using only resources available within walking distance of their homes. Wild herbs gathered from riverbank and desert margins provided psychoactive enhancement and flavoring, while date syrup from local palms contributed sweetness that fermented into additional alcohol, creating beverages that, while lacking the exotic sophistication of aristocratic brews, possessed distinctive character and consciousness-altering properties that fully served their intended purposes of nutrition, intoxication, and spiritual enhancement. The social functions served by peasant brewing extended far beyond individual household consumption to encompass community networks of mutual support, information exchange, and collective celebration that bound village populations together in relationships of reciprocity and shared identity. Evening gatherings in Seneb's courtyard regularly included neighbors, relatives, and visiting workers who contributed their own brewing knowledge and shared in the household's beer production, creating informal networks that facilitated technical innovation, social bonding, and collective resilience against the economic and environmental challenges that constantly threatened peasant survival.
The psychological effects of regular peasant beer consumption revealed the profound wisdom of brewing practices that provided optimal consciousness alteration for individuals whose daily lives required both physical endurance and emotional resilience in the face of constant uncertainty and hardship. The moderate but consistent alcohol intake achieved through daily beer consumption created psychological cushioning against anxiety, depression, and despair, while maintaining the mental clarity and physical coordination necessary for successful agricultural work, creating optimal psychological conditions for sustaining hope and determination despite the precarious nature of peasant existence. The medical understanding that had developed within peasant brewing culture encompassed sophisticated awareness of beer's therapeutic properties and potential dangers, leading to the development of brewing variations designed to address specific health conditions and physiological needs throughout different life stages. Heckett's brewing knowledge included formulas for strengthening beer intended for nursing mothers, mild preparations suitable for children and elderly family members, and medicinal brews that incorporated specific herbs known to address common ailments like digestive problems, joint pain, and respiratory infections that frequently affected agricultural workers. The economic implications of peasant brewing practices revealed the crucial role that household beer production played in peasant survival strategies, providing not only direct nutritional value, but also tradable commodities that could be exchanged for other goods and services within village economies.
Seneb's family regularly traded surplus beer for pottery, textiles, and other household necessities, while also providing brewing services for neighbors who lacked the knowledge or equipment to produce their own beverages, creating informal economic networks that enhanced community resilience and individual family security. The seasonal variations in peasant brewing reflected the profound connection between fermentation practices and agricultural cycles that governed rural Egyptian life, with different brewing strategies employed during planting, growing, harvest, and flood seasons to optimize both resource utilization and beverage quality. The strongest beers were typically produced during harvest time, when grain was most abundant, while lighter preparations sustained families through the challenging months before new crops became available, demonstrating remarkable sophistication in long-term planning and resource management that enabled peasant families to survive economic fluctuations that might otherwise prove catastrophic. The cultural significance of peasant brewing achievement lay not in competition with aristocratic excess, but in the preservation and transmission of fundamental human knowledge about fermentation that represented one of civilization's most important technological achievements. The brewing practices maintained in households like Seneb's represented direct connections to the earliest human experiments with controlled fermentation, techniques that had been refined over thousands of years of practical application to create optimal solutions for converting available plant materials into beverages that could sustain both body and spirit under challenging conditions.
The intergenerational transmission of brewing knowledge within peasant families created educational processes that combined practical training with cultural continuity, ensuring that each new generation possessed the skills necessary for independent survival while maintaining connection to ancestral wisdom that had proven its effectiveness over centuries of application.
Seneb's grandchildren learned brewing techniques alongside agricultural skills, absorbing not only technical knowledge, but cultural values that emphasized patience, observation, and respect for natural processes that governed both plant growth and fermentation. The environmental adaptation demonstrated by peasant brewing practices revealed remarkable flexibility and creativity that enabled common families to produce effective beverages despite variations in available ingredients, climatic conditions, and economic circumstances that might otherwise disrupt brewing operations. Hecat's brewing techniques included contingency procedures for managing fermentation during unusually hot or cold weather, alternative ingredient substitutions when preferred materials became unavailable, and storage methods that preserved beer quality during extended periods when fresh production might be impossible. The spiritual dimensions of peasant brewing encompassed religious and philosophical understandings that treated fermentation as a sacred process connecting human activity with cosmic forces governing transformation and renewal throughout the natural world. Seneb and his family approached their daily brewing activities with reverence and gratitude that recognized their dependence on divine forces that enabled grain to transform into beverages capable of sustaining human life and consciousness, creating spiritual practices that integrated practical work with religious devotion in ways that enriched both brewing effectiveness and family spiritual life.
The democratic nature of fermentation knowledge within peasant communities created social structures that facilitated information sharing, technical innovation, and mutual support in ways that transcended economic hierarchies and political divisions that might otherwise fragment rural populations. The brewing expertise that Seneb and Hecat had developed over decades of practice was freely shared with neighbors and relatives, creating community networks that ensured brewing knowledge remained accessible to all families, regardless of their economic status or social position within village hierarchies. As evening settles over Seneb's simple courtyard and the familiar sounds of fermentation provide gentle accompaniment to family conversations and quiet reflection on the day's activities, we witness the enduring foundation upon which Egyptian civilization was built, not in the spectacular achievements of pharaohs and priests, but in the patient daily work of common people whose brewing practices sustained both individual survival and collective cultural continuity across millennia of historical change. In the flickering light of simple oil lamps, surrounded by clay vessels that bubble with the same mysterious transformations that sustained their ancestors since the dawn of Egyptian history, this humble family embodies the profound truth that the most powerful and enduring human technologies are not those that impress with their complexity or expense, but those that serve fundamental human needs with reliability, adaptability, and wisdom refined through countless generations of practical application and loving care.